Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. In today's tutorial, we're going to learn how to create a Bailey bridge generator in Blender using geometry nodes. Let's dive into it. Next, under the Modifier tab, in the Bridge panel, you can adjust the bridge width. The Truss panel allows you to control the number of trusses, where 1 represents a single truss, 2 is for a double truss, and 3 is for a triple truss. You can also modify the truss height, where 1 means single story and 2 means double story. The abutment panel lets you change the pier type, offering 4 different options. You can also increase the number of piers, with 2 meaning no pier. Additionally, you can adjust the height of abutments and piers using the height slider. The height offset option allows you to increase or decrease pier height as needed. First, add a Bezier curve. Set the radius to 15 meters. In edit mode, press V and set the handle type to vector. First, we will convert the curve into multiple curves. To achieve this, we will add a curve to mesh. We will use a curve line in profile and type the start and end x values to -2 and 2. Finally, we will instance the center deck plate. Using an Instance on Points node, we will drag the deck plate center from the asset collection. To ensure proper spacing, we will resample the curve using length and set the length to 1.5 meters. Next, we will add a Subdivide Curve node to add more curves. Now set the cuts to 3. We will use a Delete Geometry node to remove unwanted edges. Selecting Edge as the type, we will add a Compare node, set it to equal, and assign the value 1. Additionally, we will use an Edge Vertices node, connecting vertex index 1 to A and vertex index 2 to B. Now right-click on the Delete Geometry node and link to View. Turn on the attribute text. Now we can see 5 curves. Let's mark the index number. First, I will mark a line at the start and end of the bridge. Turn off the Viewer node. We can see that the instance is placed on the vertex. Select Edge because we want to instance on Edge. Mark the edge index. Delete the Viewer node. Place Mesh to Points and select Edge. Now the deck plates are as we wanted, and the deck plate line up with start and end on the bridge length. Okay, now let's rotate the curve. Press RZ in 15. Shift A and apply all transform. Now you can see our deck plate is rotated wrong. To fix this, we will use Align Rotation to Vector, choose X, and plug in the curve tangent. So now nothing is happening because we have instanced on the mesh. It needs to be a curve to get the tangent value. So capture the tangent value now. Use store named attribute and plug it before the mesh to points node. Select vector and plug the curve tangent here. Type dp. Now delete this curve tangent. Add attribute text. Select vector and type dp. We now need to convert it into a curve first. Now add mesh to curve. After capturing the curve tangent, convert it back to mesh. Use the curve to mesh node. Now rotation is fixed. Now to control the width via a modifier, press N to open the side panel and rename it width. Type as an integer. Then press N again to close the panel. Input the desired value. Next, we will add a combine XYZ node and duplicate it with Shift D. We will also add a math node, set it to multiply, and enter -1 as the value. After that, we will introduce a group input node and connect the width parameter appropriately. Now add a math node and divide by 2 because the width is equally offset on both sides. You can see that there are 5 plates in a row, so it means the bridge width is 5 meter. So for ease, I will add a math node in between and subtract 1. And in the modifier, I will type 5. And the number of cuts needs to be 2 less than the width value. So add input, add a math node and subtract 2. Then plug the value. Now change the width. Okay, now let's organize it. Move the group input and resample closer. And move these instance parts to the right side. Let's join them with Ctrl J and press F2 to rename it curve line for the deck plate. Again, Ctrl J and press F2 to rename it deck plate, and press N in the Node tab, increase the text size. Now I want to place the left deck plate. Let's right-click the Delete Geometry node, connect the mesh island. So we have curve 0, curve 1, curve 2, curve 3, and curve 4. Now curve 0 is the leftmost, so we will separate it with a separate geometry node and instance the left plate. Add a separate geometry node, select edge, add a compare node, and mesh island node. Plug the mesh island in A and select equal. Rename it left plate. select the deck plate left from the collection. Now I want to place the right deck plate. Let's right-click the Separate Geometry node. Plug the inverted, connect the mesh island. So we have curve 0, curve 1, curve 2, and curve 3. Now curve 3 is the right curve, which is 2 subtracted from the width value 5. So we will separate it, add input, and add a math node. Subtract 2 and plug in B. Copy this. Join in the geometry. Select the deck plate right from the collection. Copy this, rename it center plate. Join in the geometry. Select deck plate center from the collection. Now let's make the deck plate support. I will copy the nodes of the deck plate with Shift D. I will delete the deck plate part. Join the output in the join geometry. Mesh to curve nodes and add curve to mesh and plug the quadrilateral in the profile. Type 0.05 meters in width and 0.1 meters in height. Now delete this subtract node and select multiply in the subtract node so the number of cuts is double now. Now let's move it down by set position. Type 0.01 meters in the Z value. And now join with Ctrl J. Rename it with F2 and type deck plate support. In here, I will rename it curve line for the deck plate support. Now let's make the panel truss. I will now copy the node of the deck plate with Shift D and rename it curve line for the first truss. And rename it truss. Join in the join geometry. Drag the 3-member panel from the asset collection and plug it in the instance. Put the value of 3M in Resample curve. Delete the subtract node and also delete the subdivide curve node. Add the mesh to curve node. And delete this mesh to curve node. Now, I will create a group of these nodes since I will be using them for creating other trusses as well. Select and press Ctrl G. Press N and rename it width and add offset. Copy the input group and place it here. Disconnect the link. Plug the width and divide it by 2. Copy this node, plug the offset, and add it. Press Tab to go out of the node group. Rename it Node Offset. Type 0.75 meters in offset. Let's add set position and type by 0.455 mean in the Z value. I will now copy the node with Shift D and rename it Curve Line for the second truss. And join geometry. And type 1.207 mean in offset. I will now copy the node with Shift D and rename it Curve Line for the third truss. And join geometry. And type 1.436 min offset. Now I want to control the number of trusses. Press N type and click on panel. Rename it truss. Add input, rename it number. Select type as integer. Now press N again. Let's add an index switch. Plug the number in the index. Plug the output in the 1, 2, and 3. Copy this node setup and paste it in the second truss node setup. And plug the output into 2, 3 and the output of the index switch here. So the second truss will be generated when truss number 2 and 3 are selected. Copy this node setup and paste it in the third truss node setup and plug the output into 3. So the input of 1 and 2 is empty, hence the truss is not generated for 1 and 2. And the output of the index switch here. I will merge since the node group is the same for all 3 trusses. Now copy the truss node setup. Rename it Curve Line for the second truss. Now press N input and rename it height. Type as integer. Press N. Now add index switch and plug the input in too, and plug the height in the index. Now plug this into the remaining 2. So the curved line is generated only when the height is equal to 2. Now let's make the bracing frame. Copy this node setup, rename it curved line for the bracing frame, and rename it bracing frame here. Select the bracing frame. In the set position, type 1.045 member. Put 0.97 members in offset. Copy this node setup, rename it curved line for the bracing frame second, join in the join geometry. In set position, put a value of 2.545. Now let's make the transom. I will copy the bracing frame node setup, delete the object info, delete the index switch, and delete the node group also. And plug the curved tangent directly. Add a cube, copy it 2 times, join with join geometry. Add a combine XYZ node. Add group input and add a math node, put 4, and plug the width value into the Y component of the combine XYZ node. For the first cube, put 0.15 in X and 0.05 meet in Z, and add set position with 0.125 meet in Z value. For the second cube, put 0.005 meters in X and 0.25 meters in Z. For the last cube, put 0.15 meter in X and 0.005 meters in Z, and add set position with matter 0.125 meters in Z value. Set position X 0.225 meters in Z value.
There's a gap between the trusses. We can see here that the number of panels is just 9. The resample length method is not reliable when the bridge is rotated. We need to fix this. I'll use the count method instead, as we have a resample curve in the curve line for the first truss. Let's select number 1 and height 1. I'll set the resample to count. Now I'll set the count to 11. Now our truss spacing is fixed. Now I'll automate it. I'll press Shift-D to copy this input group. Add a curve length node. Add a math node and divide by 3. Plug the value into the count. Let's see the output number. It is 9. So we add a math node with a value of +2. Now the count number is 11. Now let's group this with Ctrl-G. Now plug this value into the input. Press Tab and rename it node count. Now let's copy this for all other curve lines.
We are in the male side length of the bridge. Set position X value to matter 0.2s and matter 0.225 meters in Z value. You can see the transom in the air on the female side length. So we use endpoint selection, put a value of 1 and 0, and connect the math Boolean with the not operation in selection. Now copy this transom node setup with Ctrl-Shift-D. Join in join geometry. Set position X value to -1.41 and 0.225 meters in Z value. Now copy this transom node setup with Ctrl-Shift-D. Set position X fem to -0.225 meet in Z value. Join in join geometry. Now copy this transom node setup with Ctrl-Shift-D. Join in join geometry. Set position value to -2.8 meters and -0.225 meters in Z value. Now let's make the transom clamp. I will copy the node setup from the truss and copy the transom node setup. Rename it curve line for the transom clamp. Delete these nodes. Select Transom Clamp 1 from the collection. Now, let's make another transom clamp. I will copy the nodes with Ctrl-Shift-D. In set position, set the X value to -1.6 meter. Now let's make another transom clamp. I will copy the nodes with Ctrl-Shift-D. Select Transom Clamp 2 from the collection. In set position, set the X value to -1.41 meter. Now let's make another transom clamp. I will copy the nodes with Ctrl-Shift-D. In set position, set the X value to -0.8 me. Now let's make the Raker. I will copy the same node setup as the transom clamp. I will now delete these nodes and clean up. Select Raker from the collection. Now the left side raker is oriented correctly, but the right side raker is not oriented correctly. So we now separate the wrongly rotated raker and rotate it. Add a separate geometry node. Add a mesh island and compare node. Set it to equal and type 1. Connect mesh island to A and connect it to selection. Copy this node setup, then join it. And connect the inverted. Select Raker 2. Now let's add the female post. Let's copy the node setup of the truss rename it curve line for the female post, and rename this female post, and join it in Join Geometry. Remove these nodes. Connect the curve tangent to align rotation to vector. Select female post from the collection. Add endpoint selection. Select the start size as 0 and the end size as 1. Now let's add the male post. Let's copy the node setup of the female post and join it. Rename it curve line for the male post, and rename this male post in Join Geometry. Select male post from the collection. Select the start size as 1 and the end size as 0. Now let's add the male post base plate. Let's copy the node setup of the male post. Rename it curve line for the first male post base plate. Rename it curve line for the second male post base plate. Rename it curve line for the third male post base plate. Rename it male post base plate, and join it in Join Geometry. Okay, now select the male base plate from the collection. For the node offset of the second base plate, disconnect it. For the node offset of the third base plate, type the offset as 1.326 member. Now let's add the female post base plate. Let's copy the node setup of the male post base plate. Rename it curve line for the first female post base plate. Rename it curve line for the second female post base plate. Rename it curve line for the third female post base plate. And join it in join geometry. Rename it female post base plate. Okay, now select the female base plate from the collection. For the node offset of the second base plate, disconnect it. For the node offset of the third base plate, type the offset as 1.326 member. Select the start size as 0 and the end size as 1. So we have made the Bailey bridge. For the abutment part, we will cover it in the next video. Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe.